Hello, guys. How are you doing, David and Phil? Well, we're back today again. David is joining us again today. He's been with us before. David is a writer in New York, and of course, Phil is my co-host. He's a writer in New York as well. You can tell us more about yourselves later on if you feel like. But I just found it interesting this week. It's like a revolution that has gone on. You have number one, the climate change conference in Glasgow, and then you had this election on Tuesday. And each of which is very important. One positive, one is not so positive from a different perspective. And I just wanted to find out, you guys, how did you go through this week? And let us know what you think about, for example, the climate change conference going on right now, and of course, how the elections on Tuesday will have an impact on what we expect to be a very tough next 4 years. Phil.
Well, George, I think that the connection, it's sort of an indirect connection between the three. The climate change conference, it was, I think we can take heart that the commitments made by the nations, at least on paper, were very serious ones, very far-reaching ones. Certainly broader and stronger than anything we've heard from previous conferences or agreements like that. But of course, as they say, the proof is in the pudding and the devil is in the details, and pick your own cliche. It remains to be seen how much they're going to take these goals seriously and take the kind of action necessary to achieve them. Now, as far as this country is concerned, of course,
let me first chip in here. What are the goals? What are the commitments that have been agreed upon? Let me just name two. One is about methane, and the other one is about deforestation. Methane is, much of methane emissions basically come from fossil fuel, as well as agriculture. The animals, they do their things. And deforestation is important because the trees absorb a lot of CO2, and what we need is that we need a reduction of CO2 and absorption of CO2 by the forest, so that we can have the warming limited at a certain point. I think there's this idea of the net zero, which everybody thinks should be good. What is a net zero? A net zero is where the warming, the increase in temperatures are kept to at least below 2% degrees centigrade compared to the level of 1860. Yeah, that's interesting. So go ahead.
No, thank you, George. Right, because I'm not as big on the scientific details, and thank you for putting that in. And methane, I think, the significance of that, of course, also is that, right, it's not just caused by cow farts, as we all like to joke about that. Methane is produced by fracking, and natural gas is being pushed by many politicians and the fossil fuel industry as either, a clean, quote unquote, alternative to traditional oil and coal extraction, or at best, sort of a midway stop between oil and coal and then going to truly renewable fuels. And yeah, in and of itself, it's still very destructive. So the fact that they actually put it on the table and didn't talk about it as I say, as this kind of transition was very, very promising. And yes, the commitment to saving the world's forests, very, very promising. So that's all good. Now, as I was saying, the question is how many of the countries will be able to honor their commitments and really take this seriously? Everybody has a different situation. Clearly, some countries in the developing world will be tempted to fudge the goals because they want to raise the standard of living of their people. And one way to encourage them not to do this and to stick to the regimen of reducing fossil fuel dependence is for a country like ours to set a good example. Now, what are we trying to do? Well, that's where it ties in, of course, to the two bills that are still, as of this broadcast, still tied up in Congress and being negotiated among the Democrats because the Republicans want nothing to do with it. And again, we're talking about the two separate bills, the infrastructure bill, which everybody loves, and the bill that includes, controversial things like universal pre-K and, of course, climate change, serious action against climate change. So where are we at? Well, we're back where we were. There are two senators, but one in particular who are holding up this larger bill. Joe Manchin III. They always say Joe Manchin III. Okay, let's add the Roman numerals. From West Virginia. It has been said, it has been documented again and again and again, this man has financial ties to the coal industry. His son is on the board of a coal company, and yet he is still allowed to block this bill and try to reduce, if not eliminate, any of the goals, any of the anti-climate change goals that are in the bill. This is a problem. There is a danger still that the bill that emerges is going to be so watered down in terms of what it does about climate change as to be meaningless. However, the Democrats are over a barrel on this because, unfortunately, Manchin and Senator Sinema from Arizona, their votes are necessary because the Democrats have such a slim majority in Congress. We've, gone over this ad nauseum, but apparently, I don't know, every day it seems like you hear like you're on the verge of a breakthrough and this and that, and so far nothing has happened there. So we'll see. I mean, Biden, I think, has done everything that he can to emphasize the urgency of passing both bills, but there's still this blockage going on in Congress. And we can talk more about, who's to blame here and what the steps, if there is a way out of this. But clearly, the two things are tied together. If we can't get a bill with a serious commitment to fighting climate change, then, it could have a domino effect. And all the promises made at Glasgow this week, they'll be a lot harder to fulfill. I don't want to say, we're doomed, but it's going to make things a lot harder. So that's kind of where we stand right now in those two.
There's a silver lining as well, though. Number one, Manchin and Sinema is coming from Arizona. Last time I checked, and I went to Arizona, it's one of the best places. Actually, the best tourism thing that I did was to go to Arizona. There's a lot of sunshine there, and Arizona could be one of those, just like Texas, very good for either wind or solar. And I would imagine that as somebody who started out her political career as a Green, she was a Green Party member and an activist, really, one of those tree huggers, she could be tempted to support the two bills at a certain point. I think somebody has to find out what is her sweet spot. So that is number one. But number two, it seems to me, David, if you remember, now all those years when you used to cover energy, that there's a lot that in these two agreements that the administration signed up to in Glasgow. Number one is that they don't have to go through Congress. Other than the money that they are trying to get through the two bills, they don't have to the commitments they made. Some of them you don't have to go through Congress because, number one, they are going to stop funding or financing coal and other fossil fuel projects overseas. And typically it's about $15 billion that the US government, through Import-Export Bank, they always give to oil companies and coal companies to go abroad. And most of those companies are doing some work in the not in the Middle East, but in Eastern Europe. And because they've been doing this, the administration has been funding these, at least both administration, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, they've been funding these companies because they want to wean off Europe from reliance on Russian gas. So if you can stop that financing $15 billion, then that can go towards renewable fuel. Of course, we also know that renewable fuels are not, it depends very much on how you define them, because a couple of years ago, we used to consider gas, the one natural gas that you do fracking of in the Appalachian as a renewable fuel. It turns out that is not, because the carbon footprint is just too high. So there are kind of things to be concerned about, but there are also positive things that I'm looking at, because number one, I just saw that the API, the American Petroleum Institute, issued a statement yesterday saying that, well, what's going on is that we have, yes, the agreements that you guys have come up with are very good, but we have somewhere we can play a role, and we can partner with the EPA so that we can come up with rules that are much more market friendly, that would support innovation, even as we support your efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. I'm going to give you a chance, David, to just now tell us what you think about this, and used to have some ideas about how we can go about this.
Well, I know first of all, thanks for inviting me. I know the focus of your podcast is on politics, and culture, but I think we're approaching this in much the same way as we approached the war on drugs, which is from a supply side perspective, which doesn't work. You can't control the supply of drugs, and the whole purpose is the whole way we found with curtailing drug use is addressing the demand side. It's the same thing with climate change. We don't, help the populace get to a real mindset change about what they're willing to change in their lifestyles and what they're willing to give up, at least in the short term, until we have an infrastructure that's going to supplant the carbon infrastructure. We're not going to get anywhere with this. So my wife and I drove to Prospect Park a few weeks ago, and I had a sort of a foretelling of what the future could look like, at least in New York City. There were in this parking lot for Prospect Park, it was filled up. We were trying to find a parking space. There were a certain number of parking spaces that were reserved only for electric vehicles. Why? Because they had charging stations attached to them. And I saw, wow, we better get our plans together to get an electric vehicle, because before we know it, if New York City and other cities want to, they can make all parking spaces all over the city equipped with charging stations, so that if you have a fossil fuel powered car, you will not be able to park. You will get a ticket just like anybody else. I mean, these are the solutions that municipalities can come up with to prod and nudge industry in the right direction. And I'm waiting for us to really use some of these tools.
That's really interesting, because one of the things that de Blasio has got me worked up on is reducing parking spots and getting rid of some lanes on BQE. And now you're coming up with an idea that looks really, this is transformational. Given that, I now have to think about myself, that I've been part of this process of carbonization, because I want to park where I want to park, but then the only way you can drive policy is to deny me that privilege, so that the next time I want to go and buy a car, I look at a car that is decarbonized. So that's a very interesting thing. But
now, of course, I want to add something to that. I mean, we all know that, right now, at least for my budget, I can't buy an electric vehicle, and most people can't. So that sort of leads to the next question: is what is policy willing to do to subsidize people's purchases or other arrangements, maybe, sharing of vehicles between, sort of in a way that Zipcar does, where people have access to electric vehicles other than buying them or getting some kind of government assistance to buy them, just the way they get government assistance to install solar panels on their roofs.
I see a problem there. The nanny state, Phil, Joe Manchin still comes there.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's against anything that doesn't involve coal. We know that. But I think in a larger sense, in responding to what David said, I think it's true. It's important that in any policy that is presented as a top-down policy, like the vaccine mandates, it's always important to consider the impact on the average person, because there are always going to be objections raised. And the goal is to make this, let's say, user-friendly or public-friendly enough so that whatever inconvenience or difficulty is caused by it can be mitigated as much as possible. I mean, for instance, I drive a hybrid, okay?
Yeah, you're one of those, what do you call that? The
early adopter.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an early adopter.
Yeah, I drive, it's a nice, Hyundai Sonata, and it's a hybrid. However, I live in New York City, where it is very, very difficult to park, where you basically have the option of searching around for a spot on the street that is not in front of a hydrant and that is on the right day of the week, although currently today, alternate side parking has been suspended for the Hindu holiday of Diwali. So thank you to my Hindu friends, but on an average day, that's not the case. And the only other alternative is to put it into a garage like the one in my building, where the prices are outrageous and they charge something like $600 a month. Now, Eric Adams, who has been elected as the new mayor of New York and will take over from de Blasio in January, is advocating more bike lanes, which of course means a little less space for cars to drive and to park. Now, as a pro-environment person, I'm all in favor of that, even as I realize that it's going to make parking even more difficult for me as someone who has a car in New York City. I'm willing to put up with that, okay, because it's for the larger good. Not everybody will, and that's why I say, whatever policy, let's put it this way, we don't want to repeat of what happened in France, where the new regulations put in by Macron's government were seen as being so burdensome to the working class Frenchmen that they, literally took to the streets in protest. We don't want to give people, particularly people in a certain party, an excuse to go to the voters and say, you see, this is what these liberals do. They dictate to you. They want to change your lifestyle. They don't care how much you suffer, blah, 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 blah. So that's, I'm in favor of all the policies we've talked about, but I just, I pray that every Democrat in a position of power keeps that in mind. What is the practical effect on the average person, and how can we make that? There's always going to be some inconvenience, but let's try to make it as minimal as possible. Let's say that. Let's try to ease the transition as much as possible, because that's the way to build popular support in the long run. Yes,
but that's the problem. The problem is the solution causes another problem. So it's an never-ending problem, because the only way to have this transition is to use more money. That is the whole concept of COP or Paris Accord or the COP26, which is for the developed countries to spend more money and give, say, $100 billion a year to non-developed or rather underdeveloped countries or slightly developing countries. Now, the problem, of course, is that you're going to ask an American to give money when he is in trouble himself or herself, and you have no mechanism to ensure that the money given to developing countries are used well for the purposes that they have been allocated for. And then you're going to ask people who think that they don't deserve to pay for your parking space in New York City because they're living in some rural part of South Idaho or in South Dakota, to pay for your parking spot on the Upper East Side. these people who are not going to allow it. And that is why you find yourself in a bloodbath that the Democrats found themselves on Tuesday. And that is just a signal to what is going to happen in 2022. And then after that, if they take control of any part of Congress, then everything is frozen for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
So how do we get out of this?
But this is what I was talking to you about the other day, George, about cities circumventing the need for federal policy. I mean, yes, there are certain things the federal government has to do just for the scale of things, but individual cities can do a lot to head off the worst effects of climate change in their own jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there needs to be more public-private partnerships to push more city officials to do that.
Mhm.
It still requires money, and it was so nice to see that Jeff Bezos pledged $2 billion of his $17 billion that he's fleecing off every Amazon worker from coast to coast, and that Steve Jobs' widow, pledged something more like 3.75 billion towards that. So in total, you have about 20 billion that have been pledged by individuals, and not just government, but individuals. And that would go a long way towards that. But what my experience watching politics is that every time you have a policy that is supposedly good, like what Biden is trying to do, the implementation becomes such a horrendous thing that it spooks off just about everybody, and then you're back to square one. So go ahead.
No, I mean, sure. That's the implementation may be the challenge right now. I mean, we all remember about 10 years ago when, the Affordable Care Act was launched, and there were all these glitches with the website and so forth, and everybody was, crying doom and all that. And fortunately, they were able to get it fixed and worked out in enough time that it didn't have, a lasting impact. And now we know that the ACA is here to stay. The Republicans couldn't kill it, and it just has to be made more expansive, which is another part, I believe, of the larger Biden bill. Now, but George, talking about the political angle in all this thing, I think that it's oh boy, as you say, first of all, I wouldn't characterize what happened on Tuesday as a bloodbath. I think that's the convenient media narrative. We're talking about two gubernatorial races in Virginia and New Jersey. And, McAuliffe, the Democratic candidate in Virginia, he lost apparently by a decent sized margin. Murphy, the incumbent Democratic governor in New Jersey, apparently has won by a very small margin. Now, it was expected he would win by a lot more. And at the beginning of the campaign, it seemed like, McAuliffe had a good chance to become governor again, as he was 4 years ago. Okay, so I mean, let's keep it in perspective. At the same time, there are some lessons and some warnings here for Democrats. I think the main lesson that I would take away from the campaign is that going, Trump is not going to work, okay? Making him the boogeyman now, it just doesn't work. It's clear that a lot of, moderate conservative, if there is such a thing, and independent voters do not want to hear about Trump. They want to hear about what you are going to do for us now. What's your current policy? We get it about Trump. Trump is bad. Okay. Trump's not in power anymore. Obviously, you're not going to convince the hardcore Trump supporters either way. You have to talk more about policy. And I'll give you.
Do you think this was a reaction to the fact that the Democrats did not pass these policies that they talked about throughout the campaign and all this time? They spent the last 9 months doing practically nothing. Or do you think that they were just overreaching?
Build Back Better would not have helped McAuliffe win.
Because of critical race theory, because of Toni Morrison's book?
No, I mean, I just think that if I accept what pundits have been saying on TV, I think that Youngkin, just playing his cards very strategically. He distanced himself enough, but not too much from Trump, and he managed to get Trump support.
No, it's clear that, right, and I was reading that today as well. It's been suggested this is going to be the playbook for Republican candidates next year. If Trump endorses you, that's fine. Don't disown him, don't reject him, but don't invite him to campaign with you either. It's like, all right, Trump endorsed me, so what? Now let's talk about X, Y, and Z. And you're right that there was a certain emphasis on critical race theory. But before we get into that, I just want to go back to one thing because, I go to New Jersey a lot. Being in New York City, we're exposed to the media market includes New Jersey. So, we know about New Jersey politics to some degree. We hear and see the ads. And one thing that struck me about this campaign was that the Murphy ad that I saw most frequently, in fact, practically the only ad that I saw, was one that showed a clip of Chitterelli, the Republican candidate, in some public forum saying that he thought the virus, that COVID-19 was not harmful to children. Okay. And then the ad takes this. I don't know if either of you guys have seen this one, but it takes, took this. And first of all, they shoot Chitterelli in that really cliched political ad thing of this kind of sepia tones and very scary. You've got this woman sounding like, your worst elementary school teacher going, extremist Jack Chitterelli. He thinks the virus isn't good, is not harmful to children. He's an extremist. He's against mandates. And that's the one thing that they hammered over and over again. Jack Chitterelli is an extremist. He's, I think they brought in Trump.
But he is actually, if you really look at he was actually, even the Republicans didn't think he was going to win. He was going to do well because he was so out of the mainstream that even his party just went in New Jersey. A Republican in New Jersey is not like one in South Carolina. So they just basically ran away from him.
Okay, that may be true, George, but here's the thing. Okay. Then you had the Chitterelli ads, and they emphasized things like, taxes are too high, which is a traditional Republican point, but it's like they kept seizing on this one comment that Murphy made a few years ago, where he said, like, well, if you're really, concerned with tax rates above everything else, then maybe New Jersey isn't your state, which is, that kind of thing is red meat to certain voters. It's like, oh, Jack, Phil Murphy doesn't care about your taxes. And he went on to talk about very mundane things. Chitterelli did in this ad about like, the lines at the motor vehicle department are still too long and COVID-19 is still a problem and Murphy didn't do enough about that. And you can say that he was exaggerating and taking things out of context and all that. But what I got from that ad was that he was talking about nuts and bolts issues that people might be concerned about. Whereas Murphy was going after like, he's an extremist, he's pro-Trump and all that. That's what I'm saying I think is a lesson going forward. One lesson for Democratic candidates next year, okay? Trump is out there, fine, but you can't just tar your opponent with the Trump brush and expect to win. You got to talk about the nuts and bolts issues such as they are.
Can I take a step back like to a sort of a 50,000 foot view and ask you guys, do you think that we are past the point where we can marshal big government to do really ambitious projects for the public good?
No, I don't think we're past that at all. I think that, listen, if they can just somehow get these two senators on board, both bills will pass. And then you can say, all right, government has done that. I mean, government can still do things. I mean, even if they had a majority of more than, if there wasn't a tie in the Senate, they could have done it. If they had 52 seats instead of 50, they wouldn't need Manchin and Sinema's vote on anything. So no, I think it's, it's always challenging. And clearly it's not where we were in the 1960s, where Lyndon Johnson had huge majorities in Congress and he could just pass through pretty much anything he wanted. But I think we can still do things. It's just become a little more tricky.
I'm not asking that theoretically, though. I'm asking in the context of where we are as a as a culture right now.
Right.
Which is where we can't get a clear majority to accomplish anything. I was with a friend of mine yesterday who was from New Jersey. He lives in New Jersey. And he made the point in Joe Manchin's defense that Joe Manchin, said, if you guys, this is not who I am. I'm not the guy who you should be relying on to pass Build Back Better with climate change infrastructure. That's not who I am. I'm in a coal state. I have coal interests. He's not denying any of that. If you really want to pass Build Back Better with climate change provisions, you need to get other Democrats elected in other states. And he has a point.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I was saying there, David. That right. I mean, and yeah, Manchin did say at one point, look, I'm not a liberal. I've never been a liberal. If you want to get done what you want to get done, elect more liberals. And that's why I would say next year there are races in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin, where there is a good chance, it's not a shoo-in certainly, but Democrats could pick up seats. And I go back to my point. If they had 2 more seats, they could still get all these bills passed without any Republican support. Now, the fact that no Republican will come on board, and the fact that there are still some Democrats who, may have qualms about this and that, okay, it's not like they have the kind of majority that Johnson or FDR had. That makes it more difficult. That's not the same thing as saying it can't be done, that government can't take any kind of sweeping action. It just means that you have to jump through a few more hoops to do it. But no, I don't believe that the concept of, sweeping government action and reform is dead. It's just, you just have to deal with not just the political realities, but kind of the cultural sense that is abroad in much of the country. The government can't do that much, that government is even the enemy, that everything should be left to the states, and that's from conservatives, and then people who might be more apolitical but are just very cynical and skeptical about government's ability to do anything. Those are obstacles, but I think they can be overcome.
I agree to an extent with Phil, because I could have made that argument, David, last year. But if you take the COVID as a backdrop, we were only able to come up with such positive things like the vaccination because of a government that threw itself towards helping to bring about the vaccination. Yes.
But remember, that was a Trump. I mean, I don't want to give him credit for anything, but Trump was behind that.
Yes, but Trump was a government. Trump was representing a government.
Yeah. I wonder if the pandemic had started under a Biden administration and we were in the situation that we're in now, would we have been able to get Operation Warp Speed off the ground? I don't know.
I think we still would. In fact, it would have been much better. And the reason I think about that, and I'm going to come back to what I'd said earlier, is that you remember that Trump did that because it is not that he was flat out going for it. It was basically a bureaucratic surge that Trump had no interest in. And if you had a president who had interest in it, it perhaps could have been better. Trump was only looking to get elected. That was all. And a lot of money that these companies put forward, in fact, was government money, except, of course, there's Pfizer. All the others got government money, not just in the United States, but around in Europe as well, which is why they pre-bought all of these vaccines. And so a government can still do something really, really good. The problem, as you identified, is that we have these differences, political differences, that much of it, to me, is all about money, who is paying what, because I don't think, for example, Joe Manchin is against big government. Number one, he voted for Trump for the Trump tax hikes. tax cuts. There were tax cuts for some people. There were tax hikes for people in New York and New Jersey. If you're in the suburbs, you don't get those tax write-offs that you used to do. So, and Trump was basically a transactional guy who was fleecing off government. So there's now no way to say that he couldn't support the government intervention. So there's no ideology. Much of this, to me, is about money, and even cinema. She has no ideology. She has moved all across the political spectrum from being a green to now conservative. Nobody believes what she says, except that she goes to get money from the companies that want her vote. They want her to stall what Biden is doing. So there is this idea that the government is a problem, but that is a narrative that is built around a conservative principle. It's not even conservative principle, it's a principle of, well-oiled money. A lot of companies that want to use these conservatives to make sure that they don't pay anything.
I don't believe government's a problem. I was asking that question in the context of in order for big government to manifest ambitious plans,
right?
You need some kind of public unity. You need a population that sees itself as a nation. Right now, we have no sense of nationhood, as far as I can tell, in this country.
Right.
Well,
I agree with that.
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
Go ahead.
I think that it's a matter of, I think when presenting any kind of sweeping program, and I give Biden credit because I think he's taken that approach. He's hammered home the fact that everybody is going to benefit in some way from his plan. And I think, because there's been this narrative the Republicans have exploited that, okay, more taxes and bigger government, it's not just about that per se. Yeah, some of them make the argument of, oh, it's an attack on your freedom. I remember somebody writing a letter to the editor making this absurd slippery slope argument that this is how socialism gets started. They start giving more to you, the average person, you become dependent, and then they can take away your freedom because, they've given you all these goodies. They've bribed you into surrendering your freedom and blah, blah, blah. No, I think what more often happens, the argument they make very subtly, of course, is that, okay, these government programs are for certain people, not for the average hardworking white American. And therefore, by emphasizing that everyone will benefit from this bill, I think, Biden is doing the right thing and he's presenting it in the right way. Now, the other aspect of this is that part of that, one of the bills, the infrastructure bill, everybody liked. I mean, that's the thing. There are some things that everybody can agree on. I think something like 15 or 16 Republican senators voted for the infrastructure bill when it was in the Senate before it went back to the House. Everybody can agree on things like, yeah, we need better roads, better bridges, better, mass transit, or everything else that's in the bill. The question, therefore, becomes the other bill, which has these more controversial aspects that, some people are accusing of only benefiting certain people, like, oh, why are we paying for, pre-K or childcare? I don't need that. I can afford a nanny. I don't care about these other people, that sort of thing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think the question is that it's impossible to get a national consensus on anything. The question is that it's just that some things are easier than others. We can all agree on repairing roads and bridges, okay? We can't necessarily agree on other things where this narrative can still take hold of, I'm not paying for what this person needs, because I don't want my taxes raised for that sort of thing. Why should I, et cetera, et cetera. That's really the challenge as I see it.
I'm just wondering, on the basis of that question, and both of you agree with what you're saying, I just have a different take on Biden. I think Biden is great. But I just want to compare the way Biden approached unity and the way Obama approached unity. because both of them are trying to come up with some programs. And you saw how Affordable Care Act was really opposed, but in the end, they were able to get it done. Would it have made a difference if Biden, the administration itself, hadn't been so much pro poor people, openly pro poor people, and particularly there is I think a feeling that when Biden talks about poor people, he's talking about minorities. He's not talking about the working class, which in this country now we know that if you're working class, you got to be white. You can't be black and working class. You can only be white and working class. So that's a tribe, the tribe of working class and the tribe of minorities. So there's a feeling that the administration has emphasized on the minorities more than, say, the working class. But if there had been that sort of feeling, that maybe they would have allowed Biden's proposals to go on. And by the way, Biden's proposals are as left as any. But then, is that where the country is? In my opinion,
George, you're forgetting something. It has nothing to do with political acumen.
Yeah.
Biden is if Biden can't get people across the aisle, who can? It's the guy who's been working across the aisle for 45 years. This is about the part of the big lie. He can't by definition get any Republican support, no matter how reasonable he is, no matter what deal brokering he's willing to do. Because if a Republican senator agrees to anything he wants to do, he's by definition not supporting the fact that Biden won the election.
Yeah, that's what I forgot that part. It's still the big lie.
Yeah.
Because go ahead.
Sorry. I go back to the fact, though, that there were some Republicans who voted for the infrastructure bill. But I agree with you, David, in a lot of issues, right. They are committed to basically Biden failing because, the line is that he is illegitimate. I guess those 15 or 16 or 19 who voted for the infrastructure bill are ready to go back to either they're retiring or they're going to go back to their voters and say, listen, I'm not saying that he's the real president, but hey, here was this cool bill to rebuild all the bridges and, so I'm not going to turn down highway money. We're all in favor of that kind of thing. But yeah, the atmosphere is what it is. And that's true. Now, George, to your point, listen, any Democratic president, governor, office holder, they're always going to be accused of, as I said, subtly or not so subtly, of tilting towards certain groups. And I do wish, I wish that Biden or other Democrats would kind of take this on and say, look, enough of this zero-sum politics that says that if your group wins, my group loses. We're trying to say these are things that benefit everybody. Even if you put it in terms of, listen, the kid who gets that government-sponsored or government-paid pre-K, the parents who gets that leave, because parental leave to stay with their kid because it's in the bill, that kid is going to benefit. That kid is going to be more likely to grow up to be a productive citizen rather than somebody who goes to jail and then has to be supported by you, the taxpayer, to keep those jails open. Put it in purely utilitarian terms if you want to, but try to emphasize that, okay, everyone will benefit. And I think it's hard. It is hard in this climate. And George, if we want to go back to, the thing that you mentioned earlier about,
education, the education aspect of it, because I don't know whether everybody is educated as to, David said, we may not be a nation because we have so many factions. And that brings the idea of education. Are everybody educated? Given that, I saw somebody says, critical race theory, but, and then the person asked, what is it? And I said, I don't know. And you're making points. You're having an lecture on the basis of something you don't actually understand. And so if you can't understand any of these things, then you're vulnerable to being lied to. And that's why you're going to believe that Biden is a rapist or rapes kids or whatever it is that the QAnon is propagating.
Yeah. By the way, I saw an interesting item on MSNBC, of course, last night, but still, it was still amusing that apparently the QAnon people gathered in Dallas over the weekend, not necessarily for a political thing, but apparently part of the theory is that certain celebrities who are supposed to be dead are not, or that even if they are dead, they're coming back. So I'm not kidding. This is what they said. They were expecting John F. Kennedy Jr. to come back from the dead. And apparently this past weekend was the date certain that that the leaders or whoever they are of this movement had said, yeah, he's coming back, and of course it'll be Dallas because that's where his father got killed. Anyway, but on a serious note, George, yeah, I did want to say something about critical race theory in the time we have left, because that clearly was a factor in the Virginia race. It might have been in the New Jersey race as well. My take on it and what I've been reading is that it is a mistake for Democratic candidates to kind of just say, look, this is a straw man, and this is like an academic theory that might be taught in some colleges where if your student is a college student, he doesn't have to take that particular class. Clearly, Republicans had pushed this narrative that no, it's seeping down into the schools as well. There have been some stories about that in some school districts. There have been lists of recommended reading that have included things by Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and so forth. Okay. Unfortunately, this can't be ignored. What's the way to deal with it? Well, I think it also involves threading the needle. Clearly, changing the subject is not the answer either. It didn't work for McAuliffe. Dismissing it is not the answer. So maybe it just needs to be addressed in the sense of, look, we're not talking about making little white kids feel guilty about being white. We're just talking about having a broader sense of where this country came from and talking about, frame it in a positive way if you have to. Say we're talking about the narrative American history, that it has these low points, but it also includes the struggle to overcome racism, the great leaders who led that fight. And yes, mention the fact that it still exists in some areas today. And, I don't know. You see, I'm kind of grasping at straws here, but I guess
yes, I know.
It's a hot potato.
It's a hot topic. I've been in the South. I can tell you that the South is a totally different thing. They have a different kind of history from American history, and their history is opposed to American history. And the only compromise that this country had is to accept the Southern history. If you accept the Southern history, then yes, we're one country. If you challenge that, then you have two countries. And so it is very hard for them, because critical race theory is actually, it's theory. It is, as you said, it's theory. And it's a very new thing, but it's a critique of culture. And it's not that nobody has taught critical race theory throughout. I mean, American education has been about critical humanities theory. And if race is part of it, then you're going to have sexuality is going to be part of it. You're going to have so many, feminism will be part of it. There is a misunderstanding of it because I haven't even studied critical race theory, but I understand what it is. It's everything that all Americans understand today. Now, it is not only the US where this is a big issue, because this is apparently, in contemporary America, the first philosophy that is coming out of America, other than naturalism of a long time ago. Because in France, they think that since George Floyd, they think that their politics has been destabilized by critical race theory, by something coming out of America. It used to be that American universities would get philosophy from France. And the first time that they're getting philosophy from America, they want to stop it as well. Macron said he doesn't want this insidious thing coming out of America.
Because they're not willing to address their own Banlieue problem.
Yes.
Yeah. All the African and Muslim immigrants in that country from former French colonies, may I add. I agree. Yeah.
Yes, because in France, the poor are actually taken out of the cities because the cities are too good for, the French elite. So right. the poor people are being taken to smaller towns.
Yeah, the banlieues, yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
Which are basically Bantustans.
It's ironic that, right. In Paris, you have the poor people in the suburbs and the rich white people in the city, whereas in this country, it's the other way around. But yeah, I know. No, listen, this is, as I say, I think that the only thing I can think of is for the typical Democratic candidate. I mean, let me go back, George, because the South is different. But that made me think on an optimistic point of view that, there was a time when the Southern point of view was quite popular throughout the country, the lost cause, the glorious South. I was recently reading an article by the distinguished historian Eric Foner, who talked about the way Robert E. Lee was made into this paragon of American manhood after the war. He was a noble soldier. He only fought for the South because he didn't want to go against his own state and blah, blah, blah. And Foner pointed out, no, Lee owned slaves. Lee was as racist as any other white man in America at that time. And that he was some kind of exception, and that he was nice to black people. He just didn't want to go against Virginia. That is total BS. And I think that even if there are some small Southern towns that insist on still having those statues of Confederate heroes in the public square, the fact is that this is something that the rest of this country has rejected. We just haven't been able to make the next step and say, okay, the problem wasn't solved at the end of the Civil War. It wasn't solved in 1965 when the Civil Rights Bills were passed. It's still with us to some degree. That to me is the challenge. But as I say, I'm optimistic because it used to be even worse in this country in terms of what we thought of was our racial history,
But that's why I think that the real solution to these problems ultimately is not going to be political. It's people hang on to systemic racist beliefs, even though they don't acknowledge that they are systemic racist beliefs, because they're a way of feeling better about their own lot in life, right? At least there's somebody lower than I am. That's where systemic racism comes from. So you have to address this stuff on a metaphysical level through how people find value in their own lives. They're not threatened by anybody else's success.
Right. This idea of comparing yourselves, and we are in America. One of the problems, we have a lot of problems, but a lot of solutions as well. But one of the things that I see is often wanting to be number one, because if you're number one, there's got to be number two, number three, number four. And nobody wants to be number two, number three, number four. They always want to be number one. So my win is your loss. Your loss is my win. And my loss is your win. And so you only have that dichotomy. You only have this either or. We cannot have this is the reason, people think that you have to be a believer to be an American. And
zero-sum politics.
Exactly. So that's one of the, but this is a culture that was nurtured that we have to be great.
The exceptionalism.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, this has been so nice. I really appreciate. This was amazingly good. I actually didn't think we were gonna have such a great podcast, but we have to do something like this again. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. We too enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. Don't forget to share, to subscribe, and also to download. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.